All right, you guys ready for the most fun part, right? I mean, litigation is fun, right? Nathan, you can do litigation and environmental, but carbon credits, right? This is the future, I think, of a lot of where the industry's going. And I'll say you have a real treat today because you have two of kind of the originals, two of the OGs in some ways of carbon credit. So JP Brisson from Latham and Watkins. So going back not only to kind of the beginning of this market, number one, if there's a big deal going on, he's probably a part of it. But the two, the most interesting fact that I learned this morning, actually has his own cook stove project that he works and he helps sponsor and work through. So not only does it on the legal side, not only is there working on the big deals, helping write a lot of the standards in this area, but actually has his boots on the ground. Right? So a good another transition to Nick Nugent from Grassroots Carbon, truly a boots on the ground guy. He has actually been living, he's lived internationally, starting to do even back in the Kyoto Protocol era with the CDM and things along that line, putting some of those initial cook stoves and other projects into place that happened there. For myself, I'll be moderating, but how it'll go is first JP will get up there. He's going to take us through a little background, a little history, some of the legal issues in that way. And then after that, Nick's going to get up here. He's going to talk about how carbon credits are actually made, how they're made and sold, specifically through regenerative grazing, here in Texas. I got a daughter who's a UT freshman this year, so I like to say it is, he's going to tell you how Bevo can solve climate change, right? He's going to get up here and tell you that, and then I'll moderate. I have a few questions that I can ask, but hopefully you guys are going to ask so many that we won't even get to a lot of mine. For my background, I'll probably pipe in a little bit every once in a while because I've been a chief sustainability officer and head of ESG at a large bank, an insurance company, an energy company, but so try to do some of that in-house counsel type perspectives as well in that. And then I just wanted to, whenever I get up here at this conference, I always want to take a chance to thank Nathan Block. For those of you that don't realize, this conference was an invention of Nathan. He's been the driving engine behind it all throughout these years. Lots of great CLE that we've had. And then former chair of the Texas Environmental Bar, right, for Environmental Natural Resource Law section, and that's also my background. So I followed in his footsteps, and not a better person that I could have followed in. So thank you to Nathan, and then I'm going to turn it over to JP.
All right. Thank you, Mike, for the introduction. Thank you, Nathan, for inviting me. Really glad to be here and see everyone. So yeah, I do have my own cook stove project. I've been doing that for 4 years. It's very rewarding. So I go down to Guatemala every summer with my kids and the school of my kids now. And we build cook stove for a week, and we raise money. And for the cook stove we do not have time to build, we basically work with an NGO on the ground that basically does the work. And I see, where's Ryan? So Ryan also knows a lot about carbon projects, and that is a project I'm doing with HELPS, which is a former partner of your prior employer. So indeed. Good. So look, I just want to quickly set the stage, right, on carbon credits. I try to restrain myself, so I only have 10 slides, but this is a topic that I'd be happy to talk about for, days. So if you have any questions, if something's not clear, please, let me know. I'm happy to engage, or we're going to have Q&As at the end, right? So we can do that as well. But if there's anything that's not clear as we go along, please let me know. Okay, let's go to, oh, I do have this. Good. Let me see. Oh, fantastic. Okay, so I'm just going to give you some history definition of carbon credits. I'm going to talk about the attributes of carbon credits, more recent developments around rating companies, which is like a recent trend, 2-year trend perhaps. Talk about the life cycle, but I think I'm going to let my colleague here cover that topic a little more. And then I have a slide on transacting carbon credits. I didn't think that would be interesting to a lot of people, but if you want, we can talk about that a lot more, okay? So I suspect these slides are going to be available to you separately after the conference. I know it's a little difficult to read, but in this space, I often hear, "Oh, this is new. It is new market. It's the wild, wild west," and that drives me crazy because the environmental commodities, of which carbon credits are, have been around since at least 1990, right? And I did my first carbon deal in 1998. So it is not a novel market anymore in my book. It is an emergent market. It is certainly niche. It's definitely not as liquid as the natural gas market, for example. But I think by now it is not accurate to describe this market as being a new market or a novel market. There's plenty of experience. And I'm not going to go through this timeline, but there's been a number of programs created over the years that essentially created environmental commodities. And it's interesting sometimes to think back to those years. Like, for example, in North America, the first climate change cap and trade program was surprisingly created in, anyone knows? Alberta. Yes, Alberta, which is an oil and gas province, created the first cap and trade program, even before RGGI and before California. So let me just move on real quick. All right, so what is a carbon credit? Okay, so here we're not talking about carbon allowances, we're talking about carbon credits that are also called offsets or emission reduction and removal. Let's just talk about what we're not going to talk about today. Allowances are authorization to emit that are issued by a governmental agency, typically pursuant to a cap and trade program, right? So California has a cap and trade program, and every year California issues allowances, and companies that are subject to the cap and trade program must comply using a mix of allowances and, surprise, surprise, carbon credits, right? So here today we're talking about carbon credits, not allowances, right? So what is a carbon credits? Now, to me this is very obvious, okay? But in Europe and in Asia, that is not a clear question and there's not a clear answer to it. But in the US, right, a carbon credit is unequivocally a general, intangible, non-financial commodity, right, that represents the additional and verified reduction, avoidance, or removal of 1 metric ton of CO2. Okay? So let's go over a couple of terms, right? General intangible, that's important because commodities are typically physical commodities like natural gas, crude oil, right? A carbon credit is electronic in nature, right? So it is not tangible, okay? It is non-financial. That's important because if it was a financial commodity, it would be subject to certain types of regulation, which would be complicated, right? Additional, in order to be created, the activity that results in the avoidance, the reduction, or the removal of greenhouse gases needs to be additional. We can talk about that separately if you have a question on that. It needs to be verified. Typically, there needs to be a third-party verification process. And it's typically, the carbon credit is issued by what we call a carbon standard in Europe, or in the US we call it a carbon registry, okay? And this is typically a non-for-profit organization that has set up rules that allows entities and persons to register activities and which will supervise the auditing of the reduction, removal, avoidance, and issue the carbon credits ultimately. I have slides on the key carbon registries and carbon standards later. And finally, tracking system. Most carbon standards have a tracking system, right, which basically identifies that at every time who owns the credit. And the idea, or the reason for the tracking system is that it avoids confusion, double claiming, and it allows people to be able to record, what they own at any one time. Okay, so at the end of the day, once a carbon credit is created by a registry, it's nothing more than a unique serial number that is, if you would, deposited in the account of the project developer, and as a result of a transaction, that person can transact the carbon credits to another party. The reason, and that's where the Europeans are confused. Europeans and Asian legal scholars sometimes think that a carbon credit is a security, okay? That is not the case because a carbon credit, just like a barrel of crude oil or natural gas, can be consumed by an end user. The way a carbon credit is consumed by an end user is by having a person or a company make a claim of offsetting. upon making the claim of offsetting, that person must retire the credit, which basically involves the registry terminating the serial number from the tracking system. And that is why a carbon credit is a commodity. It is created on one day, it is transacted, and at the end of its life, it is retired, upon which it disappears. Okay. Just to open a small parenthesis, right? So carbon credits are an environmental commodity. There are obviously many other types of environmental commodities, RINs, LCFS credits, RECs, governmental guarantees of origin in Europe, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So why is it, in my view, that carbon credits, a lot of people are confused by carbon credits because they seem that there's this perception that carbon credits are very bespoke and not standardized. And the reason is that carbon credits, other than the fact that they represent the reduction, avoidance, or removal of 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide, each carbon credit can have multiple different attributes. And each of those attributes will be interpreted by different people as drivers of quality, right? And accordingly, very often, driver of price, okay? So let me just give you a couple of examples, right? I told you that a carbon credit is issued by a registry. Well, there are many registries out there. So the first question when you see a carbon credit is to ask yourself, what registry issued the carbon credit, right? Number 2, project type. You've heard about cook stove, forestry, soil carbon, there's dairy farm, SF6, right? There are many types of activities that can result in the issuance of a carbon credit, right? So obviously the project type is important. Vintage year refers to the year when the reduction, avoidance, or removal took place, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The point is, all of these factors are actually significant attributes that drive quality differentiations. I mentioned carbon standard and registries. Again, in Europe, people refer to those as carbon standards. In the US, we say registries typically. But the longest existing registries, believe it or not, was created in 1996 by Environmental Defense Fund and Winrock, right? It was based in Arkansas, and it's now called the American Carbon Registry, and it is very active in the US and internationally. Other key registries in the US includes Verra, which was created in 2007, and the Climate Action Reserve that was created in 2001. Climate Action Reserve, people typically don't know this or remember this, but it was created by a statute of the state of California. So it is actually a quasi-governmental agency. And a lot of the protocols that were adopted by the Climate Action Reserve are referred into California regulation, promulgated by the California Air Resources Board. So not only is it a quasi-governmental agency, but its protocol are typically also written into law. There's also gold standard internationally. And what's interesting is that for 15 years, Verra, ACR, Climate Action Reserve, and Gold Standard dominated the market. They had 98% of all of the activity taking place in the carbon markets. In the last 3 years, we have seen an explosion in the number of new registries. Here I mentioned only 2, Pure Earth and Isometrics. But there are, by now, about 20 registries globally, which I would consider credible, reputable registries that will issue carbon credits. And it's fascinating to see how significantly the growth has been in this area in the last 2 years. Another recent trend or development in the market is the emergence of rating agencies. So for the longest time, right, the most significant driver of price determination were these attributes, right? But once a carbon credit was issued for one project on one registry, there was this view that all the carbon credits from that registry for this project type should be evaluated the same way, and should have the same price and same value. Comes in the rating agencies, right? So these rating companies have basically said no. There's a lot more to the quality definition of carbon credits than the process through which the registry will go through in order to list a project and issue a carbon credit. And these companies have now set up databases of projects that these companies have reviewed independently in accordance to their standard and not in connection with the project developer and not in connection with the registry. And I would say that in 2026, these companies argue, and I think they're correct, that the most significant driver of price differentiation in a market is not the registry anymore. It's not necessarily the project type, but very often it's the rating that the project gets from these rating agencies. Now, the interesting thing here is that Moody's, S&P, and all of these rating agencies that rate financial products, including bonds in the US, they are regulated by the SEC. And there are rules around conflicts of interest, what goes into a rating, et cetera, et cetera. The problem here is that these guys were created 2 years ago, and they operate like a black box. They are not regulated, and sometimes what comes out of these rating processes is surprising. So I think they're performing an interesting function in the market, but in the future, that may change. I had this slide to basically describe how a credit is ultimately issued by a registry, but I think it would be more interesting if we go through that with you, right? Okay. Okay, transacting carbon credits. So obviously this is, this is a significant component of my work did today, right? So let me just give you some quick concept, right? So once you have a commodity, how does a commodity moves around, right? Obviously, you have the companies that create the credits, like Grassroots here, Mike's company, and then you have companies that want to buy those credits for whatever reason. BP in the past, was a significant participant in the market. You've also heard of the hyperscalers, which purchase a lot of carbon credits. So how does BP or Amazon go about buying a credit, from Mike, right? So the first thing to perhaps differentiate is the market, right? There's typically two types of market. One is called the primary market. The second market is the secondary market. The primary market typically refers to the market that comprises all of the transaction when the credit is first sold by typically Mike's company to another company, either BP, or it could also be a broker or a commodities house, right? Those transactions are project-specific, the delivery is unit contingent, and they are very bespoke, very unique, right? The secondary market includes all of the transaction that typically takes place after that first sale. So if Goldman Sachs comes in and buys the credit from Mike's company, then Goldman Sachs will resell the credit on the secondary market in a way that is a lot more liquid. So they may do it on an exchange. They may also do it party to party. And very often that second transaction is what we call a firm transaction, where there's an obligation to deliver the credit on a specific date. It's also typically a transaction in secondary market, right, which is not project specific. It will be for a particular type of credit of a particular year, right, and may be a particular area. But whether it's coming from one project or another is the choice of the seller. So that is typically how the secondary market could work. On the right-hand side of the slide, right, there are just a few concepts to keep in mind when transacting carbon credits. The first one is the timing of the delivery, right? So if delivery of the carbon credit follows execution of the transaction within typically 3 days, this is what we call a spot transaction. And it typically means that the seller has the credit when the seller enters into the agreement with the buyer, okay? So it's essentially 3 days to transfer the credit from one account to the other. It can also be a forward, right? Which, for example, a forward strip would be delivering a quantity of credit, let's say 1 million credit, every year for the next 3 years. So first delivery at the end of 2026, second delivery 27, 28, et cetera, right? When it's a forward transaction, the seller may have the credits on hand at the time of execution of the transaction, or they may not. These may be credits that are expected to be created in the future, right? And of course, you may think, okay, well, what happens if the credits don't get issued? Well, that's the question, right? So that will be handled in the agreement. Forward, not to be confused with futures, right? A futures contract is a standardized contract that trades on an exchange. So ICE, for example, the Intercontinental Exchange, has a few futures contracts on carbon credits. Those are different from forward contracts, which are typically over-the-counter. Delivery obligation, very quickly. There's two types of delivery obligation. One is unit contingent, the other one is firm, okay? I'll give you a wind farm as an example because that's a renewable power concept, right? If it's unit contingent, then there's an obligation to deliver only if there's wind. If there's no wind and there's no power, then there's no obligation to deliver the power because there's no wind, right? So that's unit contingent. Firm is, it doesn't matter whether the wind blows, whether the sun blows, whether the trees are growing. If there's a date, the delivery, the credits must be delivered on that date no matter what, which typically requires the seller to go cover, right, and buy credits from another source should the source of the credits that the seller wanted to deliver from does not perform for whatever reason, right? So that would be an example of a firm transaction. And as I said earlier, most primary market transactions are unit contingent. Most secondary market transactions are firm. Go ahead.
Who are you usually working with at each of the company, right? You usually have probably a big company that's buying, maybe a small company that's selling, right? Are you working with the legal office at the big company? Are you working with the chief sustainability officer? Are you working with the CFO? Who are the cast of characters kind of on the sides of these deals that you negotiate?
Yeah, good question. So, we can talk about the hyperscalers, for example, which are, the biggest demand in the market right now. So the hyperscalers 5 years ago had no capabilities. Perhaps they had one person from their ESG team and then one environmental lawyer trying to put the first deal together. But by now, these companies are buying billions of dollars worth of credits every year, so they have dedicated, a procurement team that have extensive experience in the market. So at Microsoft, for example, is very interesting. Microsoft has a climate innovation fund, which makes investment, and that's one team. And Microsoft has a renewable energy and carbon offset procurement team, which is actually a separate team. That team reports to the chief sustainability officer of Microsoft. I think that division of labor is now pretty consistent with what other hyperscalers do. And then, of course, there is sometimes an internal legal team supporting the offset procurement acquisition business. Sometimes it is outside. Okay. Oh, sorry. Oh, please.
So if the project developer wants to connect with a company like that, is there a possibility of doing it, or it always has to go through the broker?
It's a good question. So the question is, if someone generates or creates carbon credits, will that company contact the ultimate purchaser directly, or will they go through a broker? The question is, you can do both, right? Most of the large hyperscalers have tender processes open on the web where someone can submit an application for offering carbon credits for sale. But I have to say there's a lot of special sauce involved, and there are a lot of people offering their credits. So often it's helpful to work with either a broker or a consultant that can help you go through the process. So it all depends. I assume Grassroot is big enough so they can do it on their own. And we have here you know what? That's a question for you. Sorry, I forgot.
We're work with companies all the time, right? So the
Hey,
majority.
the mic.
Oh, yeah. Is that on? There we go. Yeah, the majority of our deals are bilateral deals, right? Where our company and your company would go through due diligence, determine the contract quantity of credits to be delivered on an annual basis, the price. We'd go through all the attributes that JP showed in his slides so that there's a complete understanding of what's behind each ton, right? Because each credit represents a ton of carbon. And we would sign a bilateral deal. So by far the majority of our deals happen that way. We do participate in the RFPs and the tenders that go out, but to JP's point about you can call it secret sauce or just nuance behind each credit because there are so many different project types. It does take often a lot of conversation to understand, to get a full understanding of what the offering is and what the project is. But the short answer is we can talk about it anytime.
Because we are developing carbon credit project, Cookstone, in northern Pakistan in the high altitude area. And we will produce close to 1 million carbon credit. It's a gold standard listed project.
Very good.
But, finding the buyer, right person to talk to without the broker, finding it difficult.
It can be difficult. I thought it might be easier, but it is difficult. It takes time to find the right person to talk to, and it takes time to get traction. But that's fantastic. You're developing that work. I've worked on a lot of cook stove projects in India for a long time. It's very high impact, and I do think that what is behind each credit, kind of the narrative of how the credit was developed and what the impacts are beyond the carbon impact or the climate impact is really an important part of the credit, right? And so what we're doing at Grassroots Carbon is finding other ways to pull in data that's not carbon data, but it's biodiversity, it's water, it's livelihoods, right? So that there's actual data that shows, in addition to the carbon, this is what's happening on the ground. These are the effects your investment's having. And that's powerful for a lot of buyers because they're buying credits for, to address their emissions primarily, but they have to be selective with how they spend that funding, right? So I think for a cook stove project, really leaning into the public health benefits and the social benefits is really important.
Thank you so much for your question, because I think it's a perfect segue into your presentation. So if you want to come,
Yeah, perfect.
I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I think Aaron's going to pull it up, or do I just click right after? Well, perfect. That was a great question, and I do encourage you all to interrupt me at any time if there's a question about my presentation. Should I just click forward, y'all? Oh, wait, I'm up. Perfect. Well, awesome. My name is Nick Nugent. I'm the Director of Carbon Solutions at Grassroots Carbon. Thanks, Mike, for the introduction and JP for the presentation. I do have a long background of developing carbon projects all around the world, and I firmly believe it has been the most successful way of mobilizing capital to fight climate change. And especially in areas that otherwise aren't considered or aren't necessarily readily understood to be climate solutions or potential climate solutions, right? And so there's been a long history of kind of aid and charity and philanthropy toward developing low carbon solutions, and increasingly there's clean energy investment and new technology, but to incentivize land stewards to manage their lands in such a way that removes additional carbon from the atmosphere. This is by far the most promising market or tool to get that work done. So I'm going to try to build in a lot of what JP said so that it kind of makes his presentation tangible, or kind of create a case study out of everything JP covered. So to use a lot of his terminology, Grassroots Carbon is a project developer, right? Developing credits that we issue through a standard. They come onto a registry, right? Once they're issued on the registry, they're transferred to the buyer. The buyer pays Grassroots Carbon, and Grassroots Carbon pays our land stewards, who are actually the people on the ground doing the work that stores the carbon. So JP also mentioned, there's reductions, carbon reductions or avoided emissions, and then there's carbon removal. So that kind of bifurcation has taken place in the market over the last few years and has become something that's talked about a lot because there are different types of credits, but ultimately it's 1 ton of carbon. So in an avoided emissions or a reduction project, there's a certain number of emissions that are happening in the business as usual scenario. There's an intervention that's made. Now you can calculate how much has been reduced that would have been emitted. We don't do that kind of work. We're issuing purely removal credits. So we have a business as usual scenario on a ranch in the US, and that ranch is emitting carbon or storing some carbon in their grasslands. And then we provide an intervention with our ranchers, and then we store additional carbon. So we're actually leveraging the power of photosynthesis and the photosynthetic pump that is America's grasslands to store massive amounts of carbon in the soil. So I'm going to walk you through why we're doing that and how we do that. So why we're doing it, this is America's largest carbon opportunity. It's not a very well-known one, but grasslands and grazing lands are by far the largest land use in the US. So over 40% of the US is grazing lands and grasslands. The grasslands in the US, the Great Plains primarily, have been a huge carbon sink for a very long time. Ever since the Great Depression, there's been significant disturbance and soil loss and erosion. And now we have parts of the country that once stored and pulled carbon into the ground are actually becoming sources of carbon and emitting carbon into the atmosphere. So as we've learned about that phenomenon over the last few years, it became clear that there was a solution that was readily available. So why soil? Soil stores far more carbon on Earth than all of the atmosphere, all the biomass, the plants and trees combined, right? So it's a huge opportunity for meaningful climate action at scale. And I think one thing I'm going to bring up a lot in this conversation is the opportunity for scale, right? Because there are a lot of really promising project types. There's no silver bullet to climate change or removing massive amounts of emissions. We need all sorts of different technological solutions, natural solutions, but soil really does hold the promise of scale. In the US alone, that 40% of land mass is 655 million acres. Grassroots Carbon is has a large footprint. We have 2.3 million acres in our program right now across 22 states, but that's just a fraction of that total addressable market, right? So what we're trying to do at Grassroots Carbon is work with buyers to commit to making purchases, largely to again, bring in JP's language, forward offtake agreements, right? 3, 5, 10-year deals where they're committing to buying a certain volume of carbon credits so that we can channel funding directly to the land stewards that are managing the grasslands in the US. We brought this picture in because that is actually downtown Dallas, 1945, and you see that rancher there caring for his herd. This is an important part of, again, why we do what we do. In Texas alone, in the US, 50 million acres have been lost in the last 10 years of grasslands, right? In Texas, almost 50 acres a day are lost, right? So this is a huge issue as cities grow, as rural areas are getting developed, different competing land uses, whether it's solar development or data center development, right? Grasslands are disappearing, right? So one of the things that we do at Grassroots Carbon, or that we're proud to do, is when we sell a credit, we're passing the lion's share of that profit back to the land steward, right? We've paid $41 million to ranchers to date. That's a very real number that ranchers in the tight-knit ranching community are understanding and seeing, okay, this market's real, it's really happening. And that's a really meaningful, for each individual rancher, it's a meaningful alternative income stream that really helps them bridge the gap in an industry where there's 1 or 2 revenue events a year, right? And ranching is a difficult industry. Some of you might know, I think the average income for ranchers in the US last year was like negative $1,500, right? And every rancher we work with has a second job, right? Their ranching is a difficult business to manage, but they have something else that they have to do, right, to make ends meet. So being able to value the ecosystem services that do have a value, and now there's kind of there's a market value, right? There's not necessarily a discoverable price or not a single price that you might have for a commodity like LNG, but there are ways to arrive at a price, ways to develop bilateral agreements or work with brokers in order to sell these credits and quantify and value those ecosystem services. All right, so how do we do it? On the left here, you'll see what we call kind of a conventionally managed property. We have basically a lot of cows out in large pastures all year long. they're eating what they want, they're living, a great life. But as they eat what they want, they're kind of being very selective with what they're eating. They're typically overgrazing in these systems, which leads to bare ground, increased soil temperature, which then means microbial and fungal activity stops, which is one of the primary ways that you can boost soil health and pull carbon into the soil. That means they're spending more money on, if they're fertilizing, fertilizer, or hay is a huge cost driver for these ranchers, so they're buying tons of supplemental feed because the forage that they're growing on their properties isn't enough to maintain their herd. And then they have lower soil organic carbon, and that's ultimately what my company measures, is the amount of soil organic carbon that they can store in their soil. So they're losing carbon. The water, the soil gets very hard. It loses its sponge-like quality. It rains, and rain is becoming more and more erratic, especially in a place like Texas. You don't keep that rain in your land, it washes off. That creates problems downstream. So it's kind of a negative feedback loop that's been happening over the last few decades. So in a regenerative ranching scenario, what we call regenerative ranching, you're subdividing your pastures into smaller units of land. You're bringing all your cows onto that small unit of land for a very short period of time. They eat down the forage to a certain level. You have to watch them, and it's kind of an adaptive approach to management. They leave all their poop and pee there. They kind of stomp it into the ground, and then they move on to the next small unit of subdivided land, and you don't return back for an extended period of time, half a year or up to a year for a lot of our ranchers. So it all has to do with optimizing the rest and recovery of your pastures. And as you do that, you can see tremendous impacts in even the first 1 or 2 years of doing this. So the perennial seeds have millions of seeds stuck in the soil. They often don't get an opportunity to come back under a continuous conventional grazing system. Now you'll start seeing the perennial native seeds come back. These are deep-rooted plants that are depositing carbon deep into the soil. So one of the key things that Grassroots Carbon does that nobody else is doing in this field is we take meter-deep samples. So we're taking, on every property, we go out and we take a baseline sample, and we take meter-deep samples to see how much carbon is in the soil profile. And that is how we ultimately are quantifying the carbon. So I'll go into that now. And I realize I'm saying a lot. There's, like JP, I could talk about this for days, so I'm sorry if I'm flooding you with information. I'll go over this one real quick, but essentially, building off of JP's presentation, what we're doing is providing basically the connective tissue between ranchers, corporates who want to take climate action, and then the ecosystem services, the carbon storage that they're providing. So we're enrolling with the ranchers. We have long-term contracts with the ranchers, so we're carrying a lot of that liability. We then have contracting we have soil sampling contractors we work with who take the soil samples, do lab analysis to confirm how much carbon is in the soil, and then we have the corporate partnerships that actually drive the action on the ground because they're providing that funding. The ranchers don't have to pay anything to join our program. All the costs are covered, technical assistance and development of grazing plans, all the soil sampling, all the documentation, reporting. So it's a very low barrier to entry for ranchers. And I do see a question.
Yeah, how are you guys sort of reacting to the post-ag tech? I work in venture-backed companies.
Yeah.
How are you seeing the rise and fall of like the indigo ags of the world and the post-ag tech boom and bust affect your markets right now?
It's a good question. I will say it's kind of back on the boom after the deal with Halter, which is a collar company. They've just raised I forget how much they raised, but a $2 billion valuation for a company that makes collars for cows, right? And these are collars that you can actually kind of steer the cows remotely so that you could manage your property in a regenerative way. You can track them remotely, which is important to the work we're doing, knowing where the cows are when. And so there is increased interest in ag tech. Our solution has a lot of tech behind it, but the thing that kind of buffers us from being a purely ag tech play is we really are using photosynthesis, right? Which I like to tell people is probably technology readiness level 1,000. It's been around for millions of years, so it's really our ability to work to develop a contract with the land steward, get the land steward to buy into changing their behavior, right? A lot of this is kind of a softer work. We work with 5th and 6th generation ranchers in Texas. It's not that they're doing it wrong. There's nothing wrong. There's just an opportunity now to make, in some cases, significant amounts of money by storing carbon on your land. And we can help you do that. So I think, I don't know, Mike, do you have a response to the ag tech question? Oh, yeah. I'll keep moving. Yeah, sorry. So that's a great question, though, and I'll see if anything else comes up in this presentation. I do want to mention, too, that we can co-locate our projects with infrastructure, right? So when we're working with energy companies, these hyperscalers, food and beverage companies, wherever they have a footprint on the ground, we can kind of create a supply shed in that area, enroll ranchers in that area, so that each ton of carbon that you're ultimately using in your emissions accounting is kind of locally sourced, and your funding is going to that local community. So we've had a lot of traction with that model, and buyers really like that. So taking you left to right through some of our science, eligibility enrollment on the left, we get a full scan of your property. There's various technologies we leverage to kind of look at your property characteristics. A lot of geospatial and machine learning work goes into this, but then it is rooted in actual soil sampling. I like to say the data is in the dirt. So we stratify the landscape, basically looking at like-kind parcels on the land, same kind of slope, same soil type, allocate random sampling points. We send the sampling team out there, and they're taking meter-deep cores, right? Those cores go to a lab where they're combusted, and all that remains is carbon, and you can weigh how much carbon's in the soil and extrapolate that across the property. To kind of increase our capabilities there, we actually use electromagnetic induction, which is a near-infrared technology, so that as we're driving between sampling points, we're taking readings of the ground, and then we can kind of interpolate those with the actual physical samples. And over time, we're getting kind of a living, breathing soil carbon map. And as we do this across millions of acres, you can imagine the value in that data for decision-making for a lot of property owners. So then we put together an improved grazing management plan, what we call a GMP. You can see it's kind of small, but you can see the subdivided pastures, how many cows are going to be on each pasture when, right? And there are biogeochemical models that we can use to model, if you implement this plan, this is how much carbon per acre you're going to store, this is how much money we're going to be able to pay you, right? So we're able to set this up for a rancher and say, this is the plan, year 1, implement these practices. We maintain them years 2 through 10, or whatever their contract stipulates, and this is how much carbon is going to be stored. So then we have what Mike mentioned, we have a software called Pasture Map that allows the ranchers to develop their plan. They can access it from anywhere, online, offline. You can see your properties, move your cattle, post pictures that have the metadata behind them to show this is where the cows are when. There's various ways we do what they call MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification. So then you can see kind of an output of what it looks like there, the cows moving around the different pastures. All that gets fed back end into our models. And then year 5, every 5 years, we resample. So you have a baseline sample in year 0. We're implementing all these changes. Each year we model credits. The model inputs go to the standard. The standard issues credits. We sell them, or actually they're already sold. We share the money with the land stewards. Year 5, again, the data is in the dirt. We take a second measurement, and we can actually see in the measurements the increase in carbon. And in many cases, there might actually be additional carbon because the modeling is conservative. So there's kind of a buffer crop at year 5 and year 10. So I know that's a lot, but tried to walk you through our annual project cycle, right? So we do this every year. Every year, the ranchers issue credits, and we issue payments to the ranchers. So again, just going into our meter-deep sampling, all carbon standards, the main soil carbon standards require 30 centimeters of sampling, and we go to a meter deep. These are deep-rooted grasses. They're depositing carbon deep in the ground. If you think about carbon that's stored a meter under the ground, if you built a parking lot on top of it, it's probably still going to be there, right? So this kind of challenges a lot of the preconceptions around the durability or permanence of nature-based carbon. This is actually really fairly permanently stored. And if you go a meter deep in many areas of the Great Plains, that carbon, you can date carbon, right? It's over 10,000 years old. So what we're trying to do here is develop a cost-effective, scalable, immediately deployable, right? This isn't technology that's 5 or 10 years out, solution to climate change that also proves out the durability. As carbon moves deeper into the soil profile, it becomes mineral associated. So now it's binding with minerals. It's becoming, essentially rock down there. It's no longer organic carbon. So again, it's not going to be washed out. If there's a fire, if anything that's a regenerative event, we're not quantifying above ground carbon. It's all below ground. So there's no risk to fire like you might have in forestry. And ultimately you're building up the resiliency of the landscape, right? It's able to store more water. There's better biodiversity, which is always better for ecosystem health. and then there's better forage for the rancher, right? So they're ultimately going to have a better cattle operation with lower costs. So it's kind of a win-win-win-win-win. And I see a question.
It's been a long time since I've heard of actually, but presumably at some point you've reached saturation of carbon in the soil.
Yep.
You're generating credits on an annual basis. So I guess, have you kind of modeled that out? Like, at what point does saturation occur, and how does the model for generating the credit that kind of ensures that the activity is occurring adapt?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there are different things in the literature, and it's all very context specific. A lot of what we do has to do with each individual ranch, right? So in the Western U.S., that might be a different answer than the Southeastern U.S., but ultimately there is, and her question was, there must be a saturation point in the soil. You can't just keep pumping carbon forever. That's true to a certain degree, and you do start kind of reaching an asymptote, and so maybe kind of back of the envelope, like 30 years of doing this maybe, which is a long time, and a lot of carbon that you're going to store. Maybe we could use that as like a just quick number, like 30 years, you might start reaching an asymptote, and maybe your gains become more marginal. Over 30 years, I guess, like if we were going to say conservatively, very conservatively, considering the heterogeneity of land in the U.S., let's say 0.5 to 1 ton of carbon per acre per year. So we work with ranches of all different sizes. Some of those ranches do really well, and they're really dialing in and optimizing their rotations and their herd management, and they could easily store 2, 3, 4 tons of carbon per year. Some in more brittle, arid environments might be less than 0.5 tons per acre per year. But we work with ranches. Anybody can join our program, right? There's no barriers to entry. We're trying to open the envelope so that land stewards can participate, because we're able to aggregate them into a large-scale project. So we have ranches of a few hundred acres that might be making a few $1,000s, storing a few hundred tons, and we have ranchers that have 150,000 or 200,000 acres, and they could, not naming names, but make millions of dollars putting carbon back in the ground on their ranch, which is a significant opportunity for them. So yeah, it's always a tricky question, how many acres per ton, because it's really different. It'll be different on the other side of the highway. So the heterogeneity is something that we're solving for with our technology and the soil sampling, the kind of deep and dense sampling that we do. Yep.
Love for you to finish, Nick. I don't want to take content time away from you.
Oh, you're good. This is the most important part.
Well, and full disclosure, project developer, CEO with Carbon Road, biosystems engineer. So, certainly appreciate what you're doing. And I just want to kudos JP and Nick both. This is, you said it. It's a very difficult topic to cover in an hour. So you've done a very good job.
I don't even know what time it is.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, right. So, I do this for Oklahoma State Extension, and we spend a day with landowners just educating, right? So this is a really important piece. So I'm super happy you guys are doing that. I do want to pull on one string for JP. You mentioned the black box, right, on rating agencies, and I think that's an important part of this whole ecosystem of credits, right? I agree with the thesis on, we have a huge volume of credits out there that have very low volume or value, and we need to run that through a filter and get high quality credits. I would like to pull on that one string about the black box when it comes to early stage project development, because it's crucial. We've got to get new projects out there, and the way these projects are judged is counterfactual, right? So you're saying, hey, if this didn't exist, would this be a benefit? And it's a huge incumbency problem. And I'm a former athlete. I love to say, the national pastime is not baseball, it's transfer of blame. So I'm not trying to blame the rating agencies, but it is a problem that we don't look at future value. To Nick's point, there's a lot of future value in this rangeland. I'm in forestry. I also do industrial capture. I just would love you to talk about that a little bit in terms of what you see as that black box and some of those challenges in the rating agencies.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. It's very novel. I will give you an example. 2 years ago, no, maybe a year ago, a client got a very bad rating from one of those companies, And before our client realized what was going on, we started hearing from the client's customer that the rating agency was reaching out to the client's customer to offer for a fee a copy of the rating report. That was a bad rating report, right? So like the client was not consulted. It didn't know what the rating report was saying, but it knew it was bad. And then my client's customers were getting inbounds from the rating agency, and that's clearly inappropriate, right? So the client started reaching out to the rating agency. And make a long story short, the rating agency would not return phone calls or emails until I sent a message on LinkedIn and I said, if you don't return a phone call by 4 p.m. tomorrow, you're going to get a lawsuit. Like, you have to come sit down with us. And sure enough, they did, and we resolved the issue. But, they are completely operating, in some cases, without impunity, right? And I think it's both them kind of learning the ropes because they're still novel companies, and I don't think I don't think in my situation they were trying to do something bad. I think they were just not paying attention. But you're right. There's a significant disconnect because one report from one of them can essentially destroy significant value, and it can be erroneous. And there's no process for providing feedback or counterpoints. So I think going forward, it is very important that this area be better regulated. Otherwise, it's very arbitrary. I mean, arbitrary is the word I would use. So I agree with you.
Can I ask a question too? So, John Dorf with ISB, we are also a forestry company. We're a developer. And one of the issues that we see, because we're trying to use pre-issuance or forward contracts as our funding source, we don't have other sources of funding, that the idea of offtake agreements is kind of put a wrench in the system as far as we're concerned. Because like when, say, Microsoft, they have all these announcements of millions and millions of dollars of commitments, but they're not actually putting money out the door until the deliverable, until the credits are actually retirable. And so then you have to go finance the projects, borrow money against the projects, which we consider it potentially could harm the project. I don't know how you guys are funded, but I'm just curious about sort of, the idea of additionality should also come from the buy side too, that the project wasn't done through finance. It's done because somebody is committing to buy these, they're actually going to buy the pre-issuance credits on the market as it is today, at a discount, obviously.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great point, and the ratings question is great as well. So a great way to manage a forward offtake where credits are going to be issued in future years, a portion of that can be pay upon delivery for the buyer, but a portion of that should be prepayment for meeting certain milestones, right? If they believe in your solution, it's going to happen. Lay out your milestones. This is how many, acres of forest we're going to enroll. Contracts are in place. Sampling's done, modeling's done, right? Some of that should be prepaid in order so you have working capital, right? I think that's not too much to ask of a buyer. And I like the idea of kind of flipping the script on additionality. There's a lot of scrutiny on suppliers of carbon credits, and not as much maybe on the buy side. And so I think that's a great question. And what we do at Grassroots Carbon is we have a lot of ranchers who are interested in joining our program. Right now, what we call our pre-qualified funnel has about 10 million acres of ranches in it. And when I'm talking to buyers, I'm telling them I cannot bring these guys through the funnel until you make a commitment, because I don't want them to be putting in place practice changes, changing the way their whole operation works, if they now are going to wait after issuance for me to go out and market the credits and sell them, right? That's a delay. I'll probably lose leverage in a negotiation, right? So making the commitment now directly catalyzes us bringing those ranchers all the way through our funnel, getting the technical assistance done, getting the infrastructure put in place, the fencing, doing the sampling, right? So and that's nice for buyers because they want to be catalytic in some cases, right? And I meant to mention this earlier, but we're almost purely, in the voluntary carbon market, right? We're working with corporations who have voluntary climate commitments. They have targets. They have 2030 targets, a lot of them. And so this is all voluntary. And so, with that in mind, there should be, they should put a little bit of their skin in the game, right? I think. And on the ratings piece, the market, the buzzword for many years was transparency, right? Because how do people know what's in a carbon credit, right? Be very transparent with all your data. be as transparent as possible. So this kind of anecdote about this ratings agency moving behind the screen, it looks like market infrastructure and it looks like a market maturity to have ratings happening. But if it's not happening in a transparent way, I think it's really kind of erosive. And you know, we can't really be part of this circular firing squad. Like, the ratings agencies are here to support, they should support, and it should be very transparent. And the reason I bring that up also is because if any of you want to come to a ranch and meet a rancher who's doing this, who's in our program, I invite all of you, right? Whether you're at a law firm or you're in-house somewhere, anybody who wants to see this should come see it, right? And talk to the ranchers themselves, right? And so we're fully open book about that. We love to take people onto the ranch. For a buyer that makes a commitment into our program, all of our soil sampling data is auditable. They're welcome to go in and look at it if they have team members who can understand it or consultants who can. So really it's about being an open book, right? And the agencies that do the ratings should really come to the ranch as well. And I've heard that some of them don't do site visits, and that's concerning, because I want there to be that infrastructure that provides support to the market, but I don't want it to be detrimental or parasitic or whatnot. But
so you guys have about 2 minutes left. Is there things you want to hit, Mike, or you want to take some questions?
I was going to say, so you got a lot of outside counsel here. You got some in-house. You got some business people. So 1 minute each. Like, when you're going into these deals, what are the top issue that you're looking at? What means the most to you when you're negotiating these contracts? From Nick, from the producer side, right? JP, maybe you've seen both, right? What are the most hotly contested things?
from our side, we want to see a multi-year commitment, right? We don't really do spot transactions, so we're working on long-term carbon removal. We have a long-term contract with the rancher, so we expect that the buyer as well is willing to engage for multiple years, and we're able to deliver credits over 3, 5, 10 years. So that's one thing that I expect to see.
So I do a lot of work for developers of projects, so people who sell credits to other companies. So I think one provision which is typically overlooked is a change in law provision, because it's important in this market, because there's so many ways the carbon credits can change in its nature over the next 10 to 15 years, and depending on where it goes, it can increase in value. So it's really important to provide for, who can push the project to move somewhere else, and who gets the upside, for the value. So I think that's one example. The other provision that is often overlooked is the termination payments provision. So what happens if there's a default, right? If you have a 10-year deal with, let's say, 500,000 credits per year, it's a lot of money on the table. So how you actually calculate the damages if the contract gets terminated early is an important point.
Yeah, and I would say, I'll channel my former in-house days, right, or my current in-house, but also Chief Sustainability Officer days. For me, it's the new thing for me I'm really paying attention to is the right to report, right, especially for insetting, right, and things along that line, like who locks down that absolute right to report it, whether it's in their greenhouse gas inventory that they're doing through the GHG protocol or a different factor, but right, really locking down that I have the sole right to report these and to make claims, right, to make claims on a product maybe. I would say that I think is going to be one of the new frontiers.
Thank you, guys. We get a hand for these guys. This was a really fantastic discussion.
Thank you, Nathan.